Hello and welcome to another edition of The Debate. I'm Kavita Faye. The most unpopular president in France's history, François Hollande, has made a trip to Israel and the occupied West Bank. While in Israel, whom France helped build a nuclear reactor and assisted in their nuclear weapons program in the mid-50s, Hollande told the nuclear-armed Israel it was against nuclear proliferation. The French president said economic sanctions against Iran will remain in place unless Tehran renounces nuclear arms. And while in occupied Ramallah, he called for a total halt to Israel's illegal settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territories. In this edition of The Debate, we'll discuss France's relationship with Israel and whether it has changed under Socialist President François Hollande.
Monsieur le Président, s'il vous plaît.
French President François Hollande is in the occupied Palestinian territories on the second day of his visit to the region. Hollande's visit is a reminder of a close political and military relationship between France and Israel. The trip has mainly focused on appeasing Israelis whose nerves have been in tatters since signs emerged of a possible breakthrough in talks between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Germany. Minutes after arriving in Israel's Ben Gurion airport, Hollande reassured Tel Aviv that his country will never tolerate nuclear proliferation. But it was the France that gave nuclear weapons to Israel. France was Israel's main weapons supplier until 1962, when it withdrew from Algeria. In 1956, France agreed to supply Israel with enough basic elements to produce plutonium and obtain a nuclear reactor. French-Israel nuclear cooperation continued amid the backdrop of the US refusal to help fuel Israel's nuclear ambitions. A fresh round of talks between Britain, France, Germany, the US, Russia and China on the one side, with Iran on the other side, is just due on Wednesday. The last round, which ended on November the 10th, came close to reaching a deal, but they virtually collapsed due to France's objections. Just when those negotiations ended in Geneva, it was French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius who broke the news of no deal in place. Then it emerged that the deal wasn't reached because of France's demands. Those 4 demands were repeated by Hollande once again. These remarks, meant to reassure Israel about France's tougher stance towards Iran, come when Tel Aviv is believed to have the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, with hundreds of warheads. Israel's nuclear arms have evaded international supervision so far. Israel has dodged growing calls to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty and says such a move would be against its security. Turning a blind eye to this stubborn defiance, France calls Iran's nuclear program a threat to world peace. World peace and security seem to be France and Israel's concern only where their interests are at stake. But when Palestinian houses are demolished to free up space for illegal settlements, Palestinian rights are violated by Israeli forces, world peace and security become a far-fetched notion. Since Israel's creation in 1948, France has maintained warm ties with Tel Aviv. Relations reached a high in the early 80s under then French President Mitterrand. After Jacques Chirac came to office in 1995, Paris-Tel Aviv tie downgraded to low levels, but with Sarkozy's election in 2007, those ties revived. The timing of Hollande's visit couldn't be any better, as he sees his approval numbers plunging to a new low of 20% at home. He got a warm welcome in Israel.
Thank you. Let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Debate. Former U.S. Marine Ken O'Keefe joins us from London. And we have Congressional Defense Policy Advisor Frederick Peterson III joining us from New York. Gentlemen, welcome. Frederick Peterson, let me first start with you. How do you view French President François Hollande's visit to Israel?
Well, his visit continues a policy of support for the Palestinian state that has been unbroken through a number of French heads of government, heads of state at this point. And yet he is treading a very fine line now and maintaining that almost traditional French abstention from alliance, I think, that has exasperated NATO at times and some of his allies. And I think France is very concerned with the proliferation of nuclear weapons in that part of the world and is attempting to find a way to be assured that the security interests as they and Israel perceives them of Israel are maintained, and yet at the same time, France has also fostered the belief that each nation has a right to produce nuclear power. And so, again, this is a very fine line, and once again we see France stepping away from traditional allies and going an independent course. They have felt, I think, their own nuclear capability within France that has been exercised somewhat independently from NATO, and their foreign policy has remained somewhat aloof, shall we say, is continuing now, I think, with the French president. His problems domestically and his popularity being in the midst of a tremendous economic crisis that plagues not only France but all of Europe and threatens the world economies are also further complicating his efforts and all of our efforts to find a peaceful solution in a rather difficult circumstances.
Well, let's do somewhat of a recap here regarding the relationship, Ken O'Keefe, between France and Israel. I mean, it's interesting. It's pretty much a seesaw, erratic relationship and pattern. François Mitterrand, the relations has improved there. Then we have the French President Jacques Chirac, where relationships declined, and now, and then came Sarkozy, a warming of ties, and of course with Hollande, we're seeing that warming of ties being built up on that. Why do you think there's been this erratic pattern there regarding France and Israel and the different presidents that it's had?
Well, because politics is nothing but a stage, and the players will change their script a little bit every now and then. And right now it seems useful for France to play a different role than it did for most of the last 10 years. The gentleman in New York, with all due respect, said a couple of things that deserve responding to. One, France supposedly is very supportive of the Palestinians. Well, this is absolute nonsense unless we consider shallow talk with no actual meaningful physical actions behind it substantial, and it's not. France is part of a European Union which is doing 28 billion euros a year in trade with Israel, so it can say whatever it likes about settlements being unhelpful and so on, but that's all just a bunch of rubbish. It means nothing while they continue to do 28 billion euros a year plus in trade. Also, he said that France is concerned with nuclear proliferation. Well, how is that possible? Israel, as we've seen in the report that you just did, is not having its nuclear plant inspected. It has the worst kept nuclear program, a secret in the world, with hundreds of nuclear weapons, and Israel has stated in many different ways its willingness to literally destroy the planet if it feels its security and existence is threatened. Ultimately, Israel also has a long track record of committing massive crimes against humanity and war crimes, including such things as torturing individuals, including minors, executing humanitarian aid workers in international waters, and dropping white phosphorus and using experimental weapons in Gaza. So how can we not consider Israel to be a serious threat to international security when it clearly can commit such horrendous crimes and it has a nuclear weapons program? So these things are beyond hypocrisy, and we need to see that.
Frederick Peterson.
You'd like me to respond to that?
Yes, I do.
I think what we're trying to reach on this program is a truth, and a truth not based on exaggerated, distorted statements and provocations, but rather reach in good faith toward a truthful end with which both sides can live. And I don't want to be put into position as being a partisan on one side or another, but rather reach in good faith toward a position of honesty and integrity. And I'm afraid that we don't want the program to degenerate into my position, his position, going back and forth. But if that's the way it's headed, I suppose we could do that. France has stepped out from its NATO allies and from the United States repeatedly, and has had statements, it's true, that have been in support of the Palestinian state, and has done so at the expense of their relations with traditional allies. Whether this is good or bad is up for debate. The point to be made is this is typically French. Ever since France has always been an ally that has gone their own way several times, and they have gone their own way in building a nuclear power plant and seeing it destroyed in the Middle East already. And they have your other guest, the Marine, apparently from London. I too have a Marine Corps background, so I know something about that, and I find those positions to be a bit unusual. However, the position that France has taken has always been traditionally an independent position, and we're seeing that again today. I think they are striving, not cynically, but trying to find a way to balance the equities in the Middle East. And characterizing one side or the other pejoratively, I don't think contributes to the debate nor for the search for security and truth and the peace that we all seek in that part of the world.
Well, let's talk about more of truth as Frederick Peterson wants. Ken O'Keefe, the French president, while in Ramallah, called for a total halt of illegal settlement activities. Now, you talk about the EU. I'm assuming that perhaps that falls under this so-called Mideast Quartet, of which we don't really hear France coming out slamming the legal settlements because it appears that they're hiding under this quartet, with the EU being part of it, making these announcements. So why does he feel, the French president, while he's in Ramallah, to call for a halt, but yet prior not be vociferous about this, not being more proactive in voicing this opposition?
Well, I would go one step further, but let me thank the gentleman on that end for bringing up the truth, and let me share some truth with you. The truth be told, the so-called war on terror, which my birth nation and yours instigated, is a farcical war of terrorism in which countless people have been killed, millions of refugees have been created, millions of orphans have been created, and all this based on a false pretext that Muslims were responsible for 9/11, and everything that stems from that, including the hardship that the Palestinians have had to endure for falsely being labeled as unreasonable, unpeaceful, and ultimately Jew-hating terrorists, is so destructive that it is hard to measure it. The truth be told, that Israel was founded on terrorism, whether it's Ergen and Stern Gang, the hotel in Jerusalem they bombed, the Lavon affair, the USS Liberty, in which Israel, our supposed ally, attacked a Navy ship and killed 34 American sailors in cold blood, and attempted, to the best of their ability, to sink that ship and kill everyone, including hitting the life rafts which were put in the water when the ship was close to sinking. This is Israel for you. It has also committed atrocities in Sabra and Shatila. As I mentioned, it bombed people with white phosphorus and used experimental weapons in Gaza in 2008, 2009, and again in 2012. Ultimately, it is a long list of incredible crimes that have been totally unpunished because my birth nation, the United States, has protected it hand and foot, especially in the Security Council with vetoes. And this is the truth. And the truth is that the Palestinians have been dealing with this for decades, and they've been left abandoned not only by Western nations, but by the Arab nations, disgracefully so. And this is the bad reality of what the Palestinians have been dealing with. And to be neutral, falsely neutral, in this context is to be untruthful at best, to be a prostitute at worst. So I will not be neutral in this circumstance. I will very much side on the area of the truth. And the truth is that Israel is a criminal state which has committed so many crimes it can hardly be counted. We would need hours and hours to even begin to list them. And ultimately, if you want to talk about the Marine Corps, let's end with some real truth. Smedley Butler, the best Marine who ever lived, which I'm sure you know him, winner of 2 Congressional Medals of Honor, wrote a book that I recommend every single Marine alive, especially every Marine and every service member in the United States who swore to uphold the U.S. Constitution, read War is a Racket by Smedley Butler, because there's a Marine with some real integrity and honor and truth-telling ability.
Well, Frederick Peterson, if you have a reaction, go ahead. If not, I'm going to go with my next question.
Well, just a very quick reaction that it does the program, it does the truth, no honor, or bears it no integrity to engage in passionate, deep felt, obviously, but name calling and pejoratives back and forth. This is not the bash Israel hour, nor is it the bash anyone's hour. This is a time when we're attempting to rationally approach true facts, not put pejorative faces and slant the evidence in order to achieve some rhetorical purpose. I hope we're reaching for a higher purpose here, and that purpose should be commonly held as peace in the Middle East with integrity and justice for all sides.
Very well. Let's take a quick time out then on that note and listen to some viewer comments as posted on our Facebook page.
Hollande should focus on helping France with their economic issues and stop being a patsy for Israel. It's quite certain that the P5+1 are not eager to reach a conclusive deal on Tehran's nuclear program. The US and its allies will continue to put pressure on Tehran just to please the Israeli regime. That's a shameful statement from a terrorist like Hollande. Why all the noise on Iran, yet they are friends with Israel, which has stockpiles of nuclear weapons?
Very well. The third comment, Frederick Peterson, I don't know if you listened to it. I'd like to propose that question to you, of which it said, why all the noise on Iran, yet they are friends with Israel, which has stockpiles of nuclear weapons?
Well, I don't think it's any secret that Israel does have nuclear weapons. This is readily acknowledged by all sides. Many of those weapons and the technology was provided by France. The relationship between France and Israel continues, obviously, to the present. But I don't think France is a vassal state of Israel or of anyone else for that matter. I think France is attempting to play a larger role apart from traditional alliances and sincerely reach for peace in that region. We must also not forget that Israel is surrounded by 100 to 1 in numbers and is not an extraterritorial threat to the region, nor has it made dire threats against its neighbors except in retaliation to that which is being done to it. Incoming missiles on a daily basis hitting many innocents. And again, it's not helpful to the debate to go back and forth about this, but simply to try to recognize that there are equities on both sides here, and we should openly acknowledge those equities in order to attain the larger truth and the peace that I previously referred to, that I hope all sides are reaching for in that region.
Well, I see where you're going with that, Frederick Peterson, but at the same time, Ken O'Keefe, Frederick Peterson, my question was, why all the noise on Iran, yet they are friends with Israel, which has stockpiles of nuclear weapons? He included in that framework of his response that they're getting attacked with, I think it was missiles that you said, Frederick Peterson. Ken O'Keefe, why don't you tell us some truths behind what is going on regarding that part of his statement, as our guest Frederick Peterson said that Israel is in a region, I guess, that feels like it's threatened.
Well, you know, the first thing that should be said is that nothing I said is untruthful. So if truth is important, then I would expect to see some acknowledgement of the truth of what I said. The bombing of the King David Hotel, the Lavon affair, the USS Liberty, experimental weapons in white phosphorus being used on civilians in Gaza, executing humanitarian aid workers in international waters. We can go on and on and on. Yes, the Palestinians have also responded with some criminal activities, but in truth, you cannot blame the victim whose land has been stolen, whose people have been imprisoned, whose innocents have been killed, whose children have been violated, whose people have been tortured. You cannot blame the victim for lashing out in such circumstances, and the truth is that Israel was formed on the back of terrorism. It was formed in a way that was totally disrespectful of the Palestinian population. I have family members that fled in 1948. They had a choice, of course, stay and possibly die, leave and live, and many chose to leave and live. So the truth is that the hypocrisy couldn't be any more stark. The United States, and France for that matter, are in no moral position to be judging anybody. If we look truthfully at the record of violence over the last several decades, no one compares to the United States of America and Britain and Israel. Of all nations on this planet, no one comes close to the amount of violence and state-sponsored terrorism. And to this day, the United States continues to execute innocent people with drone strikes in the most cowardly of fashions in places like Pakistan and Yemen, and of course in Afghanistan. And ultimately, the United States has had its most impressive bedfellow in Britain and also in France and the European Union, protecting them all the way. The United States is not an honest broker any more than France is, and the proof of the hypocrisy is in fact what's been repeated more than once, and that is that Iran has the most heavily inspected nuclear program on the planet, an invasive program which probably feeds information to Mossad that is used to execute the scientists who work in the nuclear program. While it is being inspected in the most invasive of ways, while it is enduring sanctions which is harming the people of Iran, Israel continues to have favored nation trading partner status and reaps massive rewards of trade between the U.S. and the European Union, and ultimately no punishment is meted out against it while it produces nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and biological weapons, and uses many of these weapons, including experimental weapons, against civilian populations, including massive amounts of children. That is the truth, and you may say what you want to say again, but you will not be able to come back and condemn anything I've said that is in any way untruthful. Everything I have just said is truthful.
We're going to unfortunately have to end it there. We're just fresh out of time. Thank you very much. Former U.S. Marine Ken O'Keefe there talking to us from London, and Congressional Defense Policy Advisor Frederick Peterson there spoke to us from New York. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, the viewer, for watching another edition of The Debate. You can find a repeat on our program on our website, presstv.ir. From me, Kaveh Taqwa, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.